This was the Soviet T-34, a machine that had been stopping German shells like a concrete wall stops pebbles. And these British experts were about to discover why their own assessments of Soviet engineering had been dangerously, embarrassingly wrong. Before we continue this incredible journey through one of the most important technical revelations of the Second World War, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and comment below where you're watching from. Now, let us return to that cold January morning in 1944, when Western engineering confidence was about to receive a brutal wake-up call. The T-34 that sat before the assembled British officers and civilian engineers had not arrived through conventional means. Soviet representatives had shipped this vehicle to Britain as part of an exchange program, hoping to gain insights into Western manufacturing techniques while demonstrating their own capabilities. What they likely did not anticipate was how profoundly this single tank would reshape British understanding of armored warfare and force a complete reassessment of what they believed they knew about Soviet industrial capacity. The men who gathered at the proving grounds that day included some of the finest minds in British tank development. Majors and lieutenant colonels mingled with civilian specialists, each bringing their own expertise to what would become one of the most thorough technical examinations of an Allied tank during the entire conflict. These were not men easily impressed. They had seen the evolution of British armor from the lumbering monsters of the Great War to the Churchills and Cromwells, currently rolling off British production lines. They had studied German designs captured in North Africa. They believed they understood the fundamentals of tank engineering as well as anyone on Earth. That belief was about to be shattered. The examination began with the armor itself, and from the first measurements, the British engineers found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. The T-34's frontal armor was sloped at 60 degrees from vertical, a design choice that Soviet engineers, led by Mikhail Koshkin at the Kharkov locomotive factory, had championed years earlier. To British eyes, accustomed to the vertical plates of their own Churchills and the American Shermans they had been promised, this angling seemed almost primitive, a departure from the clean geometric lines that Western designers preferred. But when they calculated the effective protection, the numbers told a story that none of them had anticipated. A 45-millimeter plate angled at 60 degrees provides an effective thickness of 90 millimeters against a projectile striking perpendicular to the ground. This meant the Soviets had achieved protection equivalent to nearly double the actual steel weight, a mathematical elegance that Western designers had theoretically understood but had never implemented so thoroughly in a production vehicle. The Germans had discovered this brutal truth in 1941 when their 37-millimeter anti-tank guns bounced helplessly off advancing T-34s. Now the British were learning the same lesson, albeit in the safety of a proving ground rather than the chaos of battle. The armor's composition proved equally revealing. Soviet metallurgists had developed specially hardened steel using techniques that British mills had not mastered, creating plates that combined hardness with sufficient ductility to resist shattering under impact. The welding, which the British initially criticized as crude and careless compared to their own precise methods, proved remarkably effective in actual combat conditions. What looked like rough workmanship to eyes trained on British manufacturing standards was actually a practical adaptation to wartime realities, prioritizing speed and volume over aesthetic perfection. The implications of these findings were staggering, and the British report reflected genuine admiration rarely seen in military technical documents. The design shows a clear-headed appreciation of the essentials of an effective tank, the report noted, adjusted to the particular characteristics of the Russian soldier, the terrain, and the manufacturing facilities available. When it is considered how recently Russia has become industrialized and how great a proportion of those industrialized regions have been overrun by the enemy, with consequent loss or hurried evacuation of plant and workers, the design and production of such useful tanks in such great numbers stands out as an engineering achievement of the first magnitude. This was not faint praise from rivals trying to downplay Soviet accomplishments. This was genuine professional respect from engineers who understood exactly how difficult it was to design and produce effective armored vehicles under any circumstances, let alone the desperate conditions facing Soviet industry since 1941. The story of the T-34's design stretches back to the late 1930s, when Soviet military planners recognized that their existing tank fleet would not survive against modern anti-tank weapons. The T-26 and BT series tanks that formed the backbone of Red Army armored forces featured vertical armor because it was easier to manufacture and maximized internal volume, but tests against newer German weapons revealed their vulnerability. Something fundamentally different was needed. Mikhail Koshkin, the lead designer at the Kharkov facility, proposed a radical departure from conventional thinking. Rather than simply adding more steel to existing designs, he championed the concept of sloped armor that would multiply the effectiveness of every kilogram of steel used. The idea was not entirely new, as some French designers had experimented with angled plates, but no one had implemented the concept so thoroughly in a practical combat vehicle. The design team calculated that sloping the armor would provide dramatically better protection for the same weight, allowing the T-34 to have superior armor while remaining lighter and more mobile than tanks with equivalent protection achieved through sheer thickness. They settled on 60 degrees for the upper front plate, an aggressive angle that would cause incoming shells to strike at such an oblique angle that penetration became geometrically more difficult. The physics were unforgiving to any attacker. A round, striking, sloped armor had to cut through significantly more material than its nominal thickness, and the angling also increased the probability of deflection rather than penetration. Soviet military officials initially greeted these proposals with skepticism. Internal divisions within the leadership almost caused the entire project to be scrapped before it reached production. Conservative voices argued for proven designs, worried that radical departures from established practice would create manufacturing difficulties and mechanical unreliability. Koshkin and his team had to fight bureaucratic battles as fierce as any the tank itself would later face in combat. The vindication came in 1940 when prototypes demonstrated capabilities that exceeded all expectations. The T-34 combined its revolutionary armor with a powerful 76mm gun, a diesel engine that reduced fire risk compared to gasoline-powered alternatives, and wide tracks that distributed ground pressure across a larger area, improving mobility on soft terrain. Each of these features addressed specific weaknesses that Soviet military intelligence had identified in earlier designs and in the tanks of potential adversaries. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the T-34 was present in small numbers, but its impact on German tank crews was immediate and profound. One documented engagement saw a German panzer commander fire 8 rounds at a T-34 from 800 meters. Every shot hit, every shot ricocheted. The German 50mm gun that had destroyed Polish and French tanks with ease could not penetrate this new Soviet machine. When the T-34 finally returned fire, its 76mm round tore through the panzer like it was made of cardboard. German anti-tank gun crews experienced similar horrors. In one wartime account, a determined 37mm gun crew reported firing 23 times against a single T-34 tank, only managing to jam the turret ring without achieving a penetrating hit. The psychological effect on German troops was devastating. They had been told the Soviets were technologically backward, their equipment crude imitations of Western designs. Now they were facing machines that made their own weapons seem inadequate. The German High Command recognized the crisis immediately and dispatched a special tank commission to the Eastern Front in November 1941. The assessment was damning for German confidence. The Commission recommended that Germany would have difficulty copying the T-34 directly because of the quantity of steel alloy and diesel engines required, resources that German industry could not easily redirect from existing programs. Instead, they proposed developing a new German medium tank that would incorporate the T-34's key innovations: a long overhanging gun, good off-road mobility from large tracks, and sloped glacis armor. This recommendation would eventually lead to the Panther tank, Germany's attempt to match the T-34's capabilities. But the Panther would not enter service until 1943, leaving German forces to face the T-34 with inadequate equipment for 2 critical years of fighting. If you're finding this exploration of engineering history compelling, take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate the technical dimensions of military history. Your engagement helps this channel continue producing content about these fascinating subjects. The British evaluation at their proving grounds covered far more than armor protection. They examined the gearbox, the transmission, the suspension system, and the armament, seeking to understand how each component contributed to the vehicle's overall effectiveness. The results consistently challenged British assumptions about the relationship between manufacturing sophistication and battlefield performance. The gearbox drew particular attention. British engineers considered it crude by their standards, lacking the smooth shifting and precise tolerances that British manufacturers insisted upon. The differential clutches similarly showed evidence of rough manufacturing compared to British components. Yet the Soviet representatives who accompanied the tank pointed out that these components functioned reliably under combat conditions that would destroy more precisely engineered alternatives. The dust, mud, and extreme temperatures of the Eastern Front demanded robustness over refinement. The British noted this philosophy throughout the vehicle's design. Where Western engineers might add complexity to achieve marginal improvements in performance, Soviet designers stripped away everything non-essential. The result was a tank that could be manufactured quickly by workers with limited training, repaired in the field using basic tools, and operated effectively by crews whose technical preparation was often minimal by Western standards. This discovery forced British engineers to confront uncomfortable questions about their own design philosophy. British tanks of the period were notoriously unreliable in desert conditions, where fine sand infiltrated precisely machined components and caused breakdowns that Soviet-style robust engineering might have prevented. The Churchill, despite its heavy armor, had suffered numerous mechanical failures during early combat deployments. The British were learning that engineering excellence defined narrowly as manufacturing precision did not necessarily translate to battlefield superiority. The T-34's suspension system provided another revelation. The tank utilized a coil spring system designed by the American engineer Walter Christie, which enabled considerably longer wheel movement than conventional leaf spring systems and greater cross-country speed. Soviet engineers had acquired Christie's designs in the 1930s and developed them further, creating a suspension that absorbed the brutal impacts of high-speed cross-country movement far better than comparable Western systems. American tests of the T-34 at Aberdeen Proving Ground had led to unconditional rejection of the Christie suspension for American tanks, but the British evaluation was more nuanced. They recognized that the system's advantages in mobility might outweigh its disadvantages in manufacturing complexity, depending on the intended operational environment. The Eastern Front, with its vast distances and frequently impassable roads, placed a premium on cross-country performance that might be less critical in Western European operations. The armament evaluation produced some of the most interesting exchanges between British and Soviet personnel. British engineers questioned whether the 76mm gun was adequate for future combat, noting that German armor was growing thicker with each new vehicle introduced. The Soviets acknowledged this concern, revealing that development was already underway for an 85mm armed version that would eventually become the T-34-85. British critique of Soviet armament was simultaneously appreciative and ambitious. Their opinion of the Soviet guns was good, which could not be otherwise given that their newest Centaur tanks had only recently received 75mm guns with ballistics equivalent to American Sherman weapons. The largest caliber tank gun the British possessed was the 6-pounder, a 57mm weapon, and many Churchill tanks still carried the embarrassingly inadequate 2-pounder. In this context, the T-34's 76mm gun represented a significant capability advantage. The British solution to their armament deficiency had been developing the 17-pounder, a powerful 76mm anti-tank gun that could defeat any German armor at normal combat ranges. As they examined the T-34, British planners began considering a remarkable possibility. What if they produced their own version of the Soviet tank, equipped with this superior British gun? The concept seemed almost fantastical. Britain, one of the pioneering nations of tank development, contemplating production of a foreign design rather than their own creations. Yet the evidence before them was compelling. The T-34 was not merely adequate. It was, in many ways, superior to anything Britain had fielded or was planning to field in the near future. Discussions at the proving grounds revealed that this idea had progressed beyond mere speculation. The British expected to produce T-34 tanks for the British Army, with the T-34 equipped with a 17-pounder gun and the KV heavy tank modified to carry a 6-inch howitzer. Factory preparations were reportedly underway near Liverpool to produce 17-pound guns specifically for British-built T-34 tanks. The proposed modifications addressed perceived weaknesses while leveraging existing British manufacturing strengths. The tanks would be built with an improved gearbox and differential clutches, addressing the components that British engineers found too crude for their tastes. New centrifugal air filters would draw air from the transmission compartment, providing cleaner intake than the original Soviet design that pulled air from behind the tank, where dust kicked up by the tracks contaminated it. The welding would be performed with electrodes made from high-hardness steel, creating seams as robust as the armor plates themselves. The Soviet representatives who witnessed these discussions must have experienced complex emotions. Pride in their nation's accomplishment mixed with concern about Western powers gaining access to their most advanced military technology. The wartime alliance required cooperation, but every engineer understands the value of technical secrets. The Soviets had requested feedback on British impressions, hoping to learn from Western expertise, but they likely had not anticipated such thorough appreciation of their design philosophy. The examination also revealed certain limitations that British engineers noted with professional interest. The fuel tanks located on both sides of the turret presented a hazard in the fighting compartment, a vulnerability that could be catastrophic if enemy fire ignited the fuel. Soviet spring and summer battles of 1943 had shown increasing instances of T-34s destroyed by fire or detonation of fuel tanks, a problem that both Soviet and British engineers recognized required attention. The commander's position in the T-34's two-man turret forced a single officer to perform multiple tasks simultaneously, commanding the vehicle, identifying targets, and firing the main gun. German assessments had noted this weakness, observing that Soviet tank engagement speed suffered because the commander could not focus exclusively on situational awareness. British tanks typically featured three-man turrets with dedicated gunners, allowing commanders to concentrate on tactical decisions. The questions British engineers raised about indirect fire capability reflected their specific operational experiences. Fighting in Italy had led British forces to use tanks as artillery batteries on numerous occasions, engaging targets beyond direct line of sight. The terrain made conventional tank tactics difficult, and artillery support was not always available. British officers believed that tanks mass-produced for their army should include equipment for such fire missions, a capability the T-34 lacked. This exchange illuminated fundamental differences in tactical doctrine between nations. Soviet armored forces emphasized direct engagement at close ranges, using speed and numbers to overwhelm defensive positions. British and American doctrine placed greater emphasis on combined arms coordination and flexible employment, including roles that Soviet planners had assigned to dedicated artillery units rather than tanks. Neither approach was inherently superior. Each reflected different strategic contexts and available resources. The KV-1 heavy tank that accompanied the T-34 to British shores received equally thorough examination. This massive vehicle weighed nearly twice as much as the medium tank and carried armor that could defeat virtually any anti-tank weapon then in service. Its 76mm gun, identical to the T-34's armament, seemed inadequate to British observers who expected heavy tanks to carry correspondingly heavy weapons. British interest in mounting a 6-inch howitzer on the KV chassis reflected their understanding of heavy tank doctrine. A vehicle of such weight and protection should exploit its advantages by carrying weapons that lighter vehicles could not manage. The Soviets had actually fielded such a configuration in the KV-2, mounting a massive 152mm howitzer in an enormous turret, though they did not directly confirm this to their British hosts. The KV examination revealed another Soviet engineering approach that British observers found simultaneously impressive and concerning. The air pump on the vehicle delivered to Britain was defective, a quality control failure that would have been unacceptable in British production. Yet the Soviets produced these tanks in such numbers that individual defects mattered less strategically than the overall volume of vehicles reaching the front lines. This principle, quantity having a quality of its own, would prove decisive in the Eastern Front campaigns. German tanks were individually superior in many technical respects, particularly by 1943 when the Tiger and Panther entered service. But German production could not match Soviet output, and the industrial mathematics of attrition favored the nation that could replace losses faster. The T-34 represented the practical application of this philosophy to engineering design. Every design decision prioritized production efficiency alongside combat effectiveness. The sloped armor was actually simpler to manufacture than the complex compound curves of some Western designs, despite providing superior protection. The diesel engine used components that Soviet industry could mass produce. The Christie suspension, while sophisticated in concept, proved reliable and maintainable under field conditions. Soviet factories evacuated eastward, ahead of German advances, continued producing T-34s throughout the war, often under conditions that would have halted Western production entirely. Workers slept beside their machines, assembly lines operated around the clock, and quality standards fluctuated based on available materials and trained personnel. The result was inconsistent individual vehicle quality, but consistent strategic capability, an endless stream of adequate tanks that wore down German forces through sheer attrition. British engineers recognized this achievement for what it was, a masterclass in wartime industrial mobilization that their own nation, despite its longer industrial heritage, had struggled to replicate. British tank production during the war was plagued by design changes, manufacturing difficulties, and mechanical unreliability that limited the effectiveness of forces in the field. The T-34 showed what determined focus on essential requirements could accomplish. The German response to the T-34 provides important context for understanding the British evaluation. When German engineers examined captured T-34s in late 1941, they experienced similar revelations to their British counterparts years later. The sloped armor that had seemed theoretically interesting but practically unnecessary in pre-war assessments, proved devastatingly effective against German weapons. General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of German armored doctrine, recommended that Germany simply copy the T-34 design rather than develop a new vehicle from scratch. This suggestion was rejected for practical reasons. The T-34 used a diesel engine type that Germany did not produce. Its armor was made from specially hardened steel, using techniques German mills had not mastered, and even the track pins used different metallurgy than German industry could readily provide. Instead, Germany developed the Panther tank, incorporating the lessons of sloped armor and improved mobility while attempting to maintain German standards of manufacturing precision. The result was a vehicle that combined T-34 armor principles with German engineering philosophy, creating a tank that was technically superior to its Soviet counterpart in many individual metrics. But the Panther required 3 times the production resources of a T-34 and proved mechanically unreliable in service, particularly during its early deployments. The contrast between German and Soviet approaches illustrates the strategic dilemma facing powers that prioritize individual vehicle quality over production quantity. A Panther tank could defeat multiple T-34s in favorable circumstances, but Germany could never produce Panthers fast enough to maintain numerical parity on the Eastern Front. The mathematics of industrial warfare favored the nation that accepted good enough over perfect. British planners studying the T-34 in early 1944 faced similar calculations. The war was clearly turning against Germany, but massive operations remained ahead, including the invasion of France that would occur in June. British armor would face German tanks, anti-tank guns, and infantry weapons across terrain very different from the Eastern Front. The question was not merely academic. What kind of tanks should Britain field for the campaigns ahead? The evaluation documents reveal that serious consideration was given to British T-34 production. Factory preparations, tooling arrangements, and gun production for the modified vehicles were discussed in concrete terms rather than theoretical speculation. The British were genuinely contemplating what would have been one of the most remarkable technology transfers in military history. Ultimately, Britain chose a different path. Rather than producing T-34 copies, they modified American Sherman tanks to carry the 17-pounder gun, creating the Sherman Firefly that would provide British armored units with a vehicle capable of engaging German heavy tanks at effective ranges. This approach offered faster implementation than establishing entirely new production lines for an unfamiliar foreign design. The Firefly proved effective in combat, giving British and Commonwealth units a capability they had previously lacked. But the decision revealed continuing faith in Allied industrial cooperation over independent capability. A reasonable choice given the circumstances, but one that left Britain dependent on American vehicle production throughout the remainder of the war. The T-34's influence on post-war tank design proved enormous. The sloped armor that British engineers admired became standard on virtually every tank designed after 1945. Soviet engineers continued developing the principles established in the T-34, creating successive generations of vehicles that maintained the philosophy of effective protection through intelligent geometry rather than sheer thickness. The T-34-85, which entered production in 1944, addressed many of the original model's weaknesses while retaining its fundamental strengths. A larger 3-man turret improved crew efficiency, eliminating the commander's multitasking burden. The 85mm gun provided substantially improved anti-armor capability, though at the cost of reduced ammunition storage. The tank remained in production until 1947 and continued serving in various militaries for decades afterward. American analysis of T-34-85s captured during the Korean War confirmed the design's enduring effectiveness. While newer American tanks could penetrate the T-34 at most angles from 800 yards, The Soviet design remained competitive against contemporary weapons years after its initial development. The fundamental principles were sound, and incremental improvements had addressed the most significant weaknesses. The human dimensions of this technical story deserve attention. The engineers who designed the T-34 worked under conditions of extraordinary pressure, knowing that their decisions would directly affect the survival of tank crews and potentially the outcome of their nation's struggle for existence. Mikhail Koshkin himself did not survive to see the vindication of his design. He contracted pneumonia during winter testing of the prototypes and passed away in September 1940, mere months before his tank would demonstrate its capabilities against German invaders. The factory workers who produced T-34s in evacuated plants, often working 16-hour shifts in unheated buildings during Russian winters, sacrificed their health and sometimes their lives to maintain production. The crews who fought in these tanks faced German weapons that, by 1943, had been specifically developed to defeat them. The Tiger tank's 88mm gun could penetrate T-34 armor at ranges where Soviet crews had no effective response. Yet the T-34 remained the backbone of Soviet armored forces throughout the war because it represented an optimal balance of capability and producibility. Soviet industry manufactured approximately 84,000 T-34s during the conflict, a production volume that no other nation matched for any single tank design. This flood of vehicles overwhelmed German attempts to maintain qualitative superiority through better individual tanks. The lessons the British engineers learned during their evaluation of the captured T-34 extended beyond immediate wartime applications. They gained appreciation for design philosophies that prioritized battlefield effectiveness over manufacturing elegance, for the strategic importance of production volume in industrial warfare, and for the unexpected capabilities of an adversary they had underestimated. The admission that they had underestimated Soviet armor design was not easy for British engineers to make. Britain had pioneered tank development, fielding the first operational tanks during the Great War, and continuing to innovate throughout the interwar period. The idea that Soviet engineers, working in a nation that had only recently industrialized, could produce designs superior to British efforts in key respects challenged professional pride and national assumptions about technical capability. Yet, the evidence was undeniable. The T-34's sloped armor provided better protection for less weight than any British tank then in service. Its gun was more powerful than British tank armament. Its mobility in difficult terrain exceeded British designs. These were not matters of opinion but measurable facts that no amount of national pride could dismiss. The 1944 evaluation represented a turning point in British military thinking about Soviet capabilities and about the nature of effective military technology. The assumptions that had guided British tank development, emphasizing manufacturing precision and traditional engineering approaches, proved less appropriate for modern armored warfare than the Soviet philosophy of robust, easily produced, and combat-effective designs. This lesson would influence post-war British tank development, though not always successfully. British tanks of the Cold War era often struggled with the same tensions between sophisticated engineering and practical battlefield requirements that the T-34 evaluation had illuminated. The Chieftain tank of the 1960s, for example, featured excellent armor and armament, but suffered from an unreliable engine that limited its operational effectiveness. The T-34's legacy extends beyond specific design features to the broader question of how military technology should be developed and evaluated. The tank demonstrated that success in armored warfare depends not merely on individual vehicle capabilities, but on the entire system of design, production, deployment, and tactical employment. A tank that cannot be produced in adequate numbers, maintained in the field, or operated effectively by available crews offers less military value than a simpler design that achieves all these requirements. Modern military procurement continues to struggle with these tensions. Contemporary main battle tanks cost millions of dollars each and incorporate technology that makes them individually formidable but strategically limited by production constraints. The lessons of the T-34, developed during humanity's most destructive conflict, remain relevant for understanding how nations should balance quality and quantity in military equipment. The British engineers who examined that captured T-34 in early 1944 could not have anticipated how their observations would resonate decades later. They were focused on immediate wartime requirements, evaluating whether Soviet designs offered advantages worth incorporating into British production. Their conclusions, documented in reports that survived the war and eventually became available to researchers, provide invaluable insight into a pivotal moment in military technological history. The tank itself, or vehicles like it, continued fighting long after the men who examined it had moved on to other assignments. T-34s served in the Korean War, various Middle Eastern conflicts, and remained in storage arsenals well into the Cold War era. The design's longevity testified to the soundness of the principles that Soviet engineers had established and that British evaluators had recognized. If you've stayed with this exploration to the end, consider subscribing to support more content like this. Military history reveals not just battles and campaigns, but the technological and industrial foundations that determine their outcomes. The story of the T-34 and its evaluation by British engineers illuminates how assumptions can blind even experts to capabilities they should have recognized, and how wartime pressure forces honest assessment of strengths and weaknesses regardless of national pride. The admission that they had underestimated Soviet armor was ultimately a credit to British engineers' professional integrity. They could have downplayed the T-34's capabilities, emphasizing its rough manufacturing and design compromises while dismissing its strengths as irrelevant to British requirements. Instead, they provided honest evaluation that recognized genuine achievement regardless of its source. Their report stands as testimony to the principle that effective engineering assessment requires objectivity above all else. The T-34 that sat on British proving grounds that cold January day represented more than Soviet industrial achievement. It represented a challenge to assumptions about the relationship between sophistication and effectiveness, between tradition and innovation, between established powers and emerging rivals. The British engineers who admitted they had underestimated its armor were acknowledging not just a technical fact, but a broader reality about the changing nature of military power in the modern age. The lessons they learned, documented in reports that would circulate through British military and industrial establishments, influenced decisions that shaped armored warfare for generations. The sloped armor that had seemed so unusual became standard. The philosophy of design for production became accepted doctrine. The recognition that less developed nations could produce world-leading military technology became inescapable reality. From that evaluation at a British proving ground in 1944 emerged understanding that would reshape tank design worldwide. The T-34 had already changed the Eastern Front, stopping German advances and enabling Soviet counteroffensives. Now it was changing Western thinking about what effective tanks should look like and how they should be built. The story of British engineers capturing a T-34 and admitting they had underestimated its armor is ultimately a story about the limits of assumption and the importance of empirical assessment. The men who conducted that evaluation served their nation by providing honest analysis that challenged comfortable beliefs. Their willingness to acknowledge Soviet achievement, even when it reflected poorly on British accomplishments, demonstrated professional integrity that remains admirable decades later. The T-34 earned its place in military history through battlefield performance, but its influence extended far beyond the campaigns where it fought. Through evaluations like the British examination of 1944, its principles spread to armies that had initially dismissed Soviet capabilities. The tank that emerged from Kharkov to surprise the world eventually reshaped armored warfare globally, one honest assessment at a time. The winter wind howled across the British testing grounds as a group of engineers in thick wool coats circled an olive-green machine that had traveled thousands of kilometers from the frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front. This was no ordinary tank.